The last day of death row. Inmate Alan Lee. The execution that ended the electric chair forever. What happens when the pursuit of justice ends in a scene so disturbing it shakes an entire state? On July the 8th, 1999, Alan Lee Davis, a man convicted of a brutal triple homicide, was strapped into Florida's electric chair. But what followed wasn't a quiet, clinical execution. It was a spectacle that sparked outrage, lawsuits, and ultimately, the end of electrocution in the state of Florida. Davis had spent 16 years on death row, offering little remorse and no public apology. But it wasn't his crimes that set off a national firestorm, it was how he died. Witnesses watched in horror as blood trickled from his face, smoke rose from the hood, and his massive body convulsed beneath the straps. By sunrise, Florida wasn't debating his guilt. They were questioning their own justice system. This is the story of Alan Lee Davis and the final 24 hours that would change capital punishment in America forever. Dear friends, Alan Lee Davis had waited 16 years for this day. 16 years behind cold prison walls, labeled by many as a monster, others as a symbol of the state's justice. On July the 7th, 1999, the day before his execution, he woke up in his cell inside Florida State Prison, no longer clinging to appeals or press interviews. Time had finally run out. That morning, the lights in his cell buzzed on at 6:00 a.m. Davis, who weighed over 340 pounds, likely hadn't slept much. For hours, he had stared at the ceiling, listening to the mechanical echoes of the prison doors clanking, guards walking past, the occasional murmur in the hallway. But this wasn't just any morning. It was the last full day he'd ever live. His breakfast arrived, a plastic tray with cold eggs, toast, and grits. He stared at it for a long while before picking at a single piece of toast, then placing it back down. His hands trembled slightly. The guards took note. Davis, known for his silence and bulk, was uncharacteristically restless. He slowly made his way to the corner of the cell, where a small metal sink and mirror waited. Splashing water onto his face, he paused to stare into the cracked reflection. Gone was the rage-filled man who once terrorized a family. In his place, a gray-haired figure, sagging under the weight of age and time. Davis didn't say much that morning. He rarely had. He gave no final interviews, made no declarations of innocence. His crimes spoke loudly enough. On May the 11th, 1982, Davis had entered the Jacksonville home of Nancy Weiler. She was pregnant and home with her two daughters, Christina, age 9, and Catherine, age 5. What happened inside that house was a scene so brutal, so personal, that even seasoned detectives struggled to process it. Nancy was beaten to death. Her daughters suffered equally horrifying fates. The youngest girl's skull was fractured by a handgun blow. Davis would later claim it was a robbery gone wrong, but the ferocity of the attack said otherwise. He was arrested shortly after, covered in blood, with no explanation that could erase what had been done. Now, 17 years later, justice was closing in. At 10:30 a.m., lunch arrived. Another bland meal slid through the cell door. Davis didn't touch it. He sat in silence, staring at the wall. A Bible sat on the corner of his bed, untouched or read. No one could say for sure. But like many inmates, in their final moments, Davis seemed to retreat inward. By early afternoon, his attorney visited, delivering the final blow. No more legal options. No stay. No appeal. The path forward was sealed. Davis reportedly nodded, then sat back down on his bunk, eyes vacant. Whatever hope had flickered that morning was gone. At 4:00 p.m., a prison chaplain arrived. Davis, still mostly silent, barely acknowledged him. The weight in that cell was unbearable. Time was moving forward, but for Davis, it had turned into a slow crawl. Each tick of the clock brought him closer to a chair that had taken lives since the 1920s. Old Sparky. Dinner came at 5:00 p.m., his last meal. Lobster tail, fried shrimp, clams, potatoes, garlic bread, nearly a liter of root beer. For a man of his size, it was considered standard. But even indulgence felt grim under the circumstances. Davis stared at the food, picked up a shrimp, chewed slowly. He barely touched the rest. Food wasn't the comfort it once had been. By 6:30 p.m., he was visibly unraveling. He paced slowly across his cell, just a few feet in each direction, back and forth. His breaths were slower now, deliberate. The numbness he had worn like armor all day was beginning to crack. When the chaplain returned for a final prayer, Davis merely nodded again, his composure slipping into exhaustion. At 9:30 p.m., Davis requested a paper. Some believe he was trying to write a final letter, a prayer, maybe a goodbye. Whatever words he put down never reached the public. No statement was released. His thoughts, like most of his life, remained locked behind thick concrete walls. By 5 a.m., July the 8th, the prison stirred to life. Outside the gates, protesters stood with signs and candles. Some demanded justice for Nancy and her daughters. Others decried the brutality of what was to come. Inside, the guards remained silent. They'd done this before. But something about this day felt different. No call came from the governor. No reprieve. No miracle. The state was ready. At 6 a.m., the chaplain returned for the last time. Davis was pale, his lips tight. He didn't resist. 12 steps separated him from the electric chair. Each one echoed through the corridor like a drumbeat. Then he arrived. Old Sparky loomed like a relic from another century, massive, wooden, unforgiving. Davis was strapped in. Leather bindings held his chest, arms, and legs in place. Electrodes were affixed, one to his shaved scalp, the other to his leg. A black hood was placed over his face. Behind thick glass, witnesses looked on. Reporters, officials, and family members of the victims. Just before the switch was thrown, Davis whispered, barely audible, "I am sorry for my victims and their families." It was the first and only sign of remorse he'd shown in nearly 2 decades. At 7:10 a.m., the first surge of electricity hit him. His body convulsed violently. Blood spurted from beneath the hood and soaked through his white shirt. Smoke curled into the air. A second jolt followed, then a third. By the end, Davis was silent, lifeless. But the horror wasn't over. Witnesses were stunned not by the death itself, but by the spectacle of it. Blood, smoke, the smell of burning flesh. State officials quickly declared the chair had functioned properly. Governor Jeb Bush minimized the incident, calling it just a nosebleed. But the public didn't agree. Photos leaked. Eyewitness accounts spread across headlines. The ACLU called for an immediate moratorium. Legal experts from across the country demanded an end to electrocution. What was meant to be a quiet execution became a national crisis. Florida had already seen warning signs. Just 2 years earlier, flames had erupted from the head of another inmate, Pedro Medina, during his execution. In Davis's case, the state had just unveiled a newly upgraded electric chair designed to be safer. But what people saw was not safety. It was something else entirely. Davis's execution was the last by electrocution in Florida. 2, not because he was the worst offender, but because his death looked too much like the very thing the state was trying to punish. What had started as justice ended in horror, and it forced an entire state to reconsider how far justice should go. The final moments of Alan Lee Davis's life were meant to deliver justice, but instead, they ignited a national reckoning. His execution, meant to be the state's ultimate statement of accountability, became a grotesque display that shook the conscience of even the most hardened supporters of capital punishment. Blood-stained and smoke-filled, the death chamber became a symbol not of closure, but of cruelty. What Davis did was unforgivable. 3 innocent lives lost in the most brutal way imaginable. Yet, in trying to carry out justice, the state crossed a line that left many asking whether justice had been served at all. In the end, Davis's execution marked the end of an era. Florida retired the electric chair shortly after, not out of sympathy, but because the image of his death was too disturbing to ignore. Sometimes, even the punishment becomes the crime. And in those moments, the system is forced to look at itself in the mirror.